I know everybody's favorite person, or one of everybody's favorite person, to talk about is Andrew Tate. Now, Andrew Tate, of course, has captured the minds and hearts of so many worldwide, and has done so for a number of years, but more specifically in the last couple of years, as he's raised in notoriety, specifically with regards to what he's going through with his court cases in Romania and the UK, and et cetera. And this video is not necessarily talking about any of that, any of the speculative stuff. Some people think they know. Some people, say that it's not true. I don't have a dog in that fight. But what I'm more so speaking to, what I care about, because that's what mainly my channel and everything I do on social media, the work that I do is geared around is men, masculinity and faith, returning men to the faith, the fullness of truth, and the fullest illumination and realization of manhood in the church, and specifically the Catholic Church. And so, Tate is one of those examples where I'm not going to come out and outright bash him out the gate, although it's quite easy to do that, and we would have proper grounds to do that as well, because he does have a very high degree of natural virtue in some areas, right? The ability to accumulate wealth, the ability to sort of to market himself, to put himself in the forefront of the spotlight. He's obviously very physically capable as well. So it's not to say that he's just completely let's just write him off as a degenerate. Spiritually, absolutely a degenerate, but in these very natural ways, if we're trying to separate, soul and the material world for a second, there is a degree of natural virtue. But as we know, and as I've spoken about so many times before, natural virtue is just a means to an end. Like, what is really the point if we're just strong for physical strength's sake, or if we're rich just simply for the sake of being rich? It doesn't really do anything for us, and it has no merit in the eyes of God, especially when how we're living is an affront to God and we're not in his proper graces. And so kind of addressing this is, there was a book written about this very thing in something called the Bible. Yeah, the super book, the Bible. In Ecclesiastes, where King Solomon, and he kind of reminds me of King Solomon now, probably a million times or more less wise, and at least 1,000 times or more less wealthy than Solomon was. But for sake of example, the parallels were that Solomon had many concubines. Solomon asked for God's wisdom, so he was very wise and ruled over Israel with a tremendous amount of wisdom, and he had a tremendous amount of wealth. And so at the end of his life, at the end of Ecclesiastes, he talked about that the sole duty of man is to obey God and keep his commandments. And to enjoy his labor, the fruit of his labor, and the wife of his youth. And that was coming from a man who enjoyed all the spoils of worldly material success, and basically, summed it up to being, vanity and a chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and the Wisdom of Solomon are some of my favorite books in the Bible, because I think it speaks directly to the heart of man and directly to the desires of man, when these desires are not properly ordered and they're not righteous, meaning they're put before God instead of secondary to God. And so it's kind of a perfect example of how fallen we've become. Somebody like Tate being this sort of pinnacle of manhood. So it's not just an example of the fallout of fatherhood and the absconding father in our society that has sort of occurred over multiple generations. One could say, with the origin being in feminism. But also just the fallout of manhood in general, which I suppose is a downstream result of the absconding father, where we don't have father figures that are raising up righteous, godly men anymore. But to anybody that's discerning, to anybody that is of the faith, that cares about obedience to God, living according to the precepts of the church, sees right through this facade of worldly manhood, and sees how effeminate Tate actually is. He's effeminate. He's completely shaven down. He talks about everything that he owns and attains, which really those things, the way that he speaks about him, really sounds like they own him. Not being able to control his sexual appetite. It's basically a total slave to his concupiscible appetite. And so very braggadocious, egotistical. And this is something that I've spoken about too, specifically with regards to training, and that this type of thing is very U-shaped, right? You start, trying to accumulate wealth or get in better shape to sort of combat effeminacy, to sort of attain some kind of a purpose, which we know is completely useless if it's not properly ordered, again, meaning under God, following the precepts of the church and the commandments. And so it's U-shaped. So you come to the most extreme point on the other side, and it just makes you more effeminate. And so he's a very spiritually effeminate man. And it kind of goes to show you like how far we've fallen as men, where this guy is sort of thrust into sort of the limelight as like a masculine role model. And like I said, he has a degree of natural virtue. He's obviously an intelligent guy, but he's an incredibly effeminate guy, where these very low level things, like I can imagine his interior life is totally void. These desires in his lower faculties completely control him. And as a result, you see this sort of inflammatory narcissistic personality come out of it, where now he's coming to a place where he's actually making fun of people's children. In particular, there's a guy named Petey on Twitter. So Andrew Tate zoomed up on a picture of his 10-year-old daughter. I mentioned how ugly she was and how his, sons are, Homo sapiens. I'll just put it that way. And so you kind of see this is what starts to happen. It's the unraveling of man when he is not living in a way that is obedient to the one true God, to the one true faith in Catholicism. And eventually, I think his demise is going to be at his own hand. But that's just, if we're just talking speculatively here. But sort of this is what happens when you reach the end of sort of material wealth and self-aggrandizement, because there's no humility in that man. There's no, chastity or charity in that man. So there's a degree of natural virtue, but again, these things are not meritorious. And eventually, you reject grace, you reject, God enough times, he kind of hands you over, just like St. Paul says in his epistle to the Romans, and you sort of become of reprobate mind. And you see Tate kind of becoming increasingly reprobate. But it kind of speaks to what's happening culturally, that there are very few, Christian men coming out of the woodwork that are actually true examples of men. And I'm not pretending that I'm that guy either. I've started talking about this because I've struggled with a certain amount of issues in my past, and I figured, hey, if I can help a guy that is a couple steps behind me, that was the whole point of me starting. And now it's, turned into what it's turned into. Glory be to Jesus Christ, of course. It's not about me, it's about God. It's about being a compass that points people to God. But guys, like, Catholic men, Christian men, this is not that difficult to do. What you see is a lot of online rhetoric about, a true man is a provider, a spiritual provider. All of those things are true. That's like A tier priority. Spiritually provide, number one, for your family. Be that man that goes to confession, that man whose the grace that God bestows onto him flows downstream through him and into his family. That's incredibly important. Living a sacramental life, staying in a state of grace, going to, participating in the Eucharist and praying with your family. Most important thing. Of course, financial provision is very important. If you can have your wife at home, that is the ideal situation. I don't think you can be a true patriarch. Otherwise, have children, love them, raise them up in the faith so they never depart, stuff like that. But that's not like the entirety. So from a spiritual perspective, it's obviously the most important thing. But it's also incredibly important, and I know I hate to beat on this drum, to be naturally virtuous as well. So these supernatural virtues build all the more on the natural. I know I've repeated this phrase so often, but I see guys like Tate, and I'm like, hey, this is not that complicated. Listen, you don't have to be a billionaire. You don't have to be shredded and jacked and ripped, but at least be an example of a natural man. And so all I'm telling Catholics, Christian men to do is like lift some weights and learn how to fight. Get your waistline in check. Practice the virtue of temperance with fasting so you have complete control of your appetite. You're subduing your appetite to the glory of God, aligning that suffering with the suffering of Jesus Christ, right? So it makes you a better believer. It makes you more like a saint. And the same thing with physical fortitude, align that with the suffering of the cross. It makes you more physically fortitudinous, if that's a word. I'm pretty sure that's a word. And again, makes you more like a saint. It's not that hard to be this kind of an example. And this is the example like our families need. This is the type of example that the younger generation of men need, because there are fathers that are completely abdicating their roles as fathers, as patriarchs. But if we're walking around and we're sweater vest wearing nerds and we're like skinny fat or overweight, you can be very pious, you can be very holy. I'm not saying like those things, you can't be holy and be overweight. Nobody's saying that. But how much more could you be if you were practicing and you are the physical embodiment of these virtues? There would be no need for men like Tate if more Christian men took this seriously. If they're like, hey, listen, I'm going to get my waistline in check. I'm going to learn to fight and defend my family. I'm going to lift some weights. I'm going to build some muscle. I'm going to learn how to fill out a t-shirt, not to my own glory, to the glory of God. And also because it just makes me healthier as well. And not just making me healthier physically, but makes me healthier spiritually as well. It's not that hard, guys. Okay. Be the spiritual provider, live a sacramental life, provide for your family financially. You love them, raise them in the faith so they never depart, but be a man. Learn to do things that men do. Physically embody these natural virtues. And how much more like a saint could you be? And again, it's a cope to say that none of the saints were jacked or muscular or knew how to fight. First of all, you don't know that. And if you're a saint, you're in the wrong place. Okay. If you're already a saint, then I'm not. So why are you watching this video? But the point is, there would be no need for a guy like Andrew Tate if more men took this side of their lives more seriously instead of coping and just thinking that robust theological knowledge would make up for that, or living a pious life would make up for that. To a degree, how much of these things are actually meritorious in God's eyes, I don't know. That's impossible to quantify, at least in my feeble mind. And of course, being pious and living in the good graces of God, being a friend to God, is the most important thing. I'm not trying to put second things first and first things second here. But the point is being an example to men, or young men and young women. So young women are pursuing guys like Tate. So young men are aspiring to be guys like Tate. If more Catholic men, if more Christian men embody the natural virtues and we're physical examples of men, and we're striving in these ways, not just in the spiritual, there would be no need. He's filling a void that men have neglected, and specifically men of faith have neglected, because we have forgotten what it means to even be the physical examples of the unceasing work for Christ. And so that's the problem with Tate. He has just like filled this void of fatherhood, this void of masculinity. And we know true manhood, true masculinity exists within the confines and is fully illuminated and realized in the church. And if more men physically understood this, that this kind of a thing is incredibly impactful on young men, young women. The physical embodiment of these virtues, the physical embodiment of the unceasing work for Christ, subduing your flesh, subduing your appetite, and being an example to a young man to say, hey, I actually want to be like that guy. Not just because he's pious and holy and all those things. That's amazing, but he's also just a man. Be a man, guys. Guys like Tate would just be a part of the niche side of the internet if more Christian men took this seriously. That's it. Glory to Jesus Christ. Like, comment, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts below.